My name is Matthew Swift. I'm the chairman and CEO of Concordia, and it is a great honor to be joined today by these esteemed panelists. Before I introduce the moderator of this opening session, I'd like to make a few points to everybody who is tuning in and joining us this morning. So first, welcome again to Concordia Live. We're happy to have you join us remotely for this important discussion. But first, a few housekeeping tips for everybody who's tuning in. All attendees are automatically muted upon entry. And to ask a question during the Q&A, please raise your hand and Concordia will take your question at different times per the moderator. Use the Q&A feature to ask questions or upvote those submitted by your colleagues, and we'll be answering those at the end of the session. Concordia will be monitoring the chat feature throughout for any questions that might be coming through, and the moderator this morning will consider any of those questions as part of the discussion. And so without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce Paula Dobriansky. Paula Dobriansky is the former Undersecretary of State for Global Affairs, a senior fellow at Harvard University Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, and is an esteemed member of Concordia's Leadership Council. As a foreign policy expert, Paula has played an incredible role throughout the entire history of Concordia in our past decade, being one of our founding Leadership Council members. And we could not think of somebody better to open the 2021 agenda than to have her both share her insights on what's happening around the world today, but also to host this discussion with her students and future leaders on this esteemed panel. So with that, I'd like to pass it to you, Paula. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Matt, and good afternoon, everybody. And Matt, I just want to really thank not only you, but also Concordia for the sponsorship of this star panel today, but also just congratulations on all the groundbreaking events and impactful events and programs that Concordia has put forward over the years. And I'm very proud to be part of the Leadership Council. So thank you so much, Matt.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you. Well, I want to get underway with our panel and introduce the stars of the next generation on this panel. But first, let me mention something for all of our viewerships that's important, that the opinions expressed by the panelists are their own and not of the US government or any particular agency, including the Department of State, the Department of Homeland Security, or the Department of Defense, or the Army. So please, we'd like our viewers to make sure that you understand these views are their own and not of any US government body. So with that, I do want to get down to our star next generation members. And I want to introduce the first person who I want to pose a question to. We have Max Castroparedes, who's a native Texan, who advises the Assistant Secretary for Border Security and Immigration at the Department of Homeland Security. And his portfolio is rather daunting. It includes a number of very tough issues like human trafficking, immigration visa reform, and also China's impact on the US education system. A graduate of the University of Virginia, Max wrote his thesis on the end of the Cold War in Central America. And in his thesis, he highlighted Secretary of State James Baker's rather extraordinary diplomacy. Now, when Max is not working so hard, he's an avid squash player, a long distance runner, and also a rower. So Max, welcome to you. We're very delighted to have you. And I want to go to you with the very first question. You know, last week we witnessed in Washington, D.C. an unprecedented event, and that was the storming of the halls of Congress. So please share with us what's your view on what took place, and welcome to you.
Well, Ambassador Dobriansky, it really is a pleasure to be here with all of you all today, and thank you, Concordia, for inviting me. I've been a big fan of Concordia for a while, and I've been a big admirer of cross-cutting partnerships and bringing together people, and especially us in our younger generation. So thank you for that. The violence we witnessed at the Capitol last week was, quite frankly, appalling. Full stop. Former Acting Secretary Chad Wolf said in his statement last week that every American is granted the right to peacefully protest. But once those protests become violent, we should enforce our laws and bring those responsible to justice, regardless of political motivations. Now in college, I interned in the US Senate, probably like a lot of you all here on this phone call. And I had the utmost respect for the men and women in uniform that make up the United States Capitol Police. And my heart just goes out to them, those officers who passed away while defending the US Capitol, Brian Sicknick and Howard Levengood. And I just really appreciate being on this call today. So thank you.
Thank you, Max, and welcome to you. Now I'd like to go to our next next generation panelist, who happens to be joining us from Seoul, Korea, and that's Heeu Millie Kim. And Heeu Millie, by the way, has lived and studied in Seoul and in Beijing, and she's fluent in both Korean and Mandarin. She's an accelerated Bachelor of Science and Master of Science Foreign Service candidate in the MSFS program at Georgetown University. She's conducted research previously on US policy in East Asia for the Korea Chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, DC, and also for the Asia Studies program at Georgetown University. Now, her areas of expertise include China policy, cybersecurity, non-proliferation, and maritime transparency in the Asia-Pacific region. Heeu Millie, welcome, and it's terrific that you're joining us today from Seoul, Korea. I don't think I want to ask you what time it is there, but if you would also give your reaction to what took place in Washington, DC last week, and welcome.
Thank you, Ambassador Dobriansky, for the introduction and welcoming remarks. I'd also like to thank the Concordia team for really inviting us to such a meaningful panel as we kick off the new year. And I think my response to the events of last week were really just also, as Max mentioned, truly like appalling and just a shock, because I viewed it as a threat to democracy and a direct attack on the peaceful transition of power. And I don't think, and as people have said, as certain people in the media have said, an act of domestic terrorism. And I view it as a culmination of the political polarization, hatred, and extremism. And watching the events unfold and also be covered in the media in Korea, I was just reminded that the world is always watching the events unfold in America, and that these events that happen in America are really in the spotlight of foreign media. And so just watching these events from abroad, I was appalled, and I truly believe that it was really a dark time for American democracy. And I think the conversations around extremism and hatred were really brought to light by the culmination of those sentiments in this event. And I think it's an important discussion to have moving forward.
Thank you, Heeu Millie, and also thank you for that perspective, because of our panelists, you're the only one that's out of the country and integrating that view into your answer. Thank you for that. Let me now go to Major Scott Modesitt, who is a U.S. Army Special Forces officer with deployments to Afghanistan. He was in Operation Enduring Freedom, Northwest Africa, and Central Asia. And for his service, he has received a number of awards and decorations, including the Bronze Star Medal, the Meritorious Service Medal, and also the Combat Infantry Badge. Scott is currently completing his Master of Science in Foreign Service at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service, and he's going to be returning to his unit this spring to command a Special Forces company. First, Major Modesitt, I do want to say to you, thank you for your service to our country. We're most appreciative of that. And we'd be very interested in hearing your perspective on the very difficult events of last week.
First of all, Ambassador, thank you for those kind welcoming remarks. And to Matt and the rest of the Concordia team, again, thank you for the invitation to be here today. It's truly an honor to be on this panel with these amazing individuals and to speak to the amazing individuals that we have watching this cast. I guess in regards to your question, just to sum up my feelings, politics aside, the one word, if I had to sum it up, would be sadness. As I watched the events unfold with my wife, who's also an active duty service member, just across the river in Arlington, as most of the country is watching hundreds, if not thousands of mobsters enter our Capitol building. It really hurt my heart. And it reminded me of other instances such as 9/11, not saying they're the same, but just the feeling that I had watching those individuals enter that Capitol building forcibly. In my mind, it was an act of sedition, an act of insurrection, and a clear case of domestic terrorism. I believe for our country to unite with the current divisiveness, it's important to allow for the lengthy investigation to hold every individual and group accountable for the actions that occurred last week, and a sign of unity going forward in order to heal our nation after the events that we witnessed last week.
By the way, Major, from here on, I'm going to call you Scott, if you don't mind. And I'd like to just interject this before I go to Tom. You know, there were a lot of think tanks in town that had different statements that they issued. And one caught my attention because they cited a quote from Abraham Lincoln. And it was as follows, quote, "There is no grievance that is a fit object of redress by mob law." I felt I had to mention that because of the terminology that you yourself used in this case. So let's now go to Tom Schiavone, who is a dual American-Australian citizen. He's a US Army veteran and previously deployed to South Korea and Ukraine. He currently serves as a hostage affairs advisor in the Office of the Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs at the US Department of State. And he's a graduate student in the Master of Science in Foreign Service program at Georgetown University. And his primary area of concentration has been US policy toward the Middle East and counterterrorism. Tom, I want to also thank you as well for your service to our country. And let's get your perspective.
Thank you, Ambassador Dobriansky, and to Concordia for this opportunity, and look forward to the rest of the discussion with my classmates. In terms of the Capitol, the assault on the Capitol, I was shocked and disgusted, like the vast majority of Americans. Like Max, I was also an intern in Congress about 10 years ago. And one of the biggest honors I had was giving tours to the Capitol to constituents. And every time I did it, I had a respect and pride in our country, and was just in awe with the history behind it. There was a moment watching it unfold that I had a hope. There was a unifying moment when all the senators were walking together back into the Senate chambers. But afterwards, just witnessing the speeches on the Senate floor, I felt like it was the same old politics going on and same old name calling. So I'm really hoping in the future, our leaders, they come together on issues like this. But it also reflected the resiliency of our system. Right after this happened, all senators went back to the floor and voted on this issue, and then the House followed after. So it really instilled a respect for the system, and I hope it did for the vast majority of Americans too.
Tom, thank you for that. And I want to move on to an area that actually is debated rather fiercely in the foreign policy community. And at the same time, we're going to be going into a transition, a governmental transition. And it's worth, I think, getting all of your perspectives on a core issue. And that is what you think are the top three, let's pick out three, national security issues confronting the United States today. So Tom, let's go to you. We're with you right now. What do you see as the top three?
So the first one I would say is China, in terms of that would be a long-term issue to me, in terms of their competitiveness with us and with the Western civilization. I think first, their activity in terms of international organizations manipulating it to their will. It's definitely an issue that we need to counter. And also exploiting the divisions in democracies around the world, their theft of intellectual property, and then also taking advantage of crises like coronavirus and the recent crisis in America with the attack on the Capitol. Second, I would say cybersecurity in general. What's the point to which we will elevate to actual physical conflict when it comes to attacks on our cyber infrastructure? I don't think there's a great answer to that, and I'm afraid that that may devolve into an instant of actual combat eventually. And then in terms of their supremacy when it comes to AI, quantum computing, that could be devastating to the United States and the rest of the world. And then third, I would actually say our deficit. I think it's gotten out of control. At this point, it's $30+ trillion. And when we do eventually get into a large-scale conflict, if we do, that's going to have an immense effect on our ability to finance that sort of conflict, finance any sort of future conflicts. And, at what point are our leaders going to tackle that issue? Because the incentive for our leaders is to spend more towards whatever projects they have.
Thank you, Tom, for that. Very interesting responses. Of course, China's very focused. Cyber, very interesting as you pick out the debt issue. Let's go to Korea. Heeu Millie. Especially because Tom started with the issue of China. Are you in agreement with what he says? How do you see it?
I'm actually in agreement with Tom on two of the top national security threats to the United States. First, I would agree with Tom that China and its threats to ideas globally and their threat to democracy and values that America upholds. And I would also agree that cyber is a top national security issue for the United States. And in addition to what Tom has mentioned, I think the transition to a remote environment during the pandemic really accelerated technological innovation, but at the same time really revealed the pre-existing vulnerabilities that existed in a lot of the networks of corporations, the government, and also individuals. And I think the cyber threat from state, but also non-state actors still remains big to the United States, and especially to its critical infrastructure networks. And this applies to the American economy, supply chains, et cetera. And so I think this is an important issue that the United States government should focus on moving forward. And the third, I actually think domestic extremism and violent insurrection is front and center, given the events of last week, but also kind of the emerging trend of the exploitation of protests, anti-government and anarchist views around the country. And I think the focus really is on kind of the role of social media in fanning the flames of political polarization and creating this ideological echo chamber online. And so I think definitely focusing on domestic extremism is important to protect American interests, American people, and institutions.
I'm very struck by the fact that both of you have woven in a number of domestic based issues. in your responses. Very, very interesting. Max, let's go to you. Same question. What's your perspective? Are you in agreement with both of them, or do you have a different take on what are the top 3 national security priorities?
Sure. No, so Tom and Heeu Millie, nailed it right on the head. China is obviously, it's a big national security threat. But if I could take it a little step further, with some stuff that, from what I've been seeing, is really their malign influence in our education system. And there was a really terrific piece featured in Axios earlier this week by Steph Knight, kind of talking about Confucius Institutes, what's been going on with State Department, DHS-led initiatives. And really, there was a really good quote talking about the reporting of American institutions not reporting the amount of money they're getting from Chinese-related entities. And the lack of reporting really makes it impossible for the US government to discern the level of potential influence of China on the US education system. And the issue has at least gotten momentum on Capitol Hill. There have been some senators like Senator Portman and Senator Cotton. They did in late 2019, the Foreign Influence Transparency Act. So this is a big issue, again, tying into the domestic concerns now with coronavirus, more issues on China. How does this relate to everything? Second point I would do briefly, and third point, I would relate it to transnational crime. And this was mentioned and highlighted in the 2017 National Security Strategy. And it just, drugs coming to the American communities, which fueling gang violence. They engage also in cyber crime, illicit opioids coming in, fed by drug cartels, and Chinese fentanyl traffickers, which kills tens of thousands of Americans each year. And so that I would definitely put at the second. And then lastly, especially being at Department of Homeland Security, illegal immigration. I was very proud about DHS's Homeland Security Assessment of that was released this fall. And what I liked most about it was really that although the majority of migrants do not pose a national security threat to the public, the pathways used by migrants to travel to the United States have been exploited by threat actors. And as a result, surges of migrants, it could be dangerous and it could impact our immigration system. And as a result of weak job rates, high crime rates, and governmental repression, as has been reported in the media, also worried about spikes at the border. But I would definitely say those are the top 3 from my perspective for what's next.
All right, I'm struck again. All the 3 of you have certainly focused on China, and then also cyber crime and international crime, and then you've woven in other elements that you see as a key challenge and challenges confronting the United States. So, Scott, let's hear your perspective. Is a defense component in there?
Thank you, Ambassador. Yes, first, I want to hit 2 of my top 3 that are also already been stated by some of the other panelists. The first, I kind of roll it up as a peer or near peer threat. So China, but I also include Russia in there as well. We've already hit China a lot. I want to talk about cybersecurity issues with Russia and the disinformation campaigns that we've witnessed over the last few elections. The rise in use of bots on online platforms just poses a great security risk going forward for any election, especially as we see the use of social media that a large majority of the population seems to be getting their news and information from. The next, violent extremism, not just domestic, but also international violent extremism. We've seen in the Middle East and Central Asia where the ISIS has been greatly diminished by not only US efforts, but also coalition efforts. But however, you have Northwest Africa where Boko Haram and Al-Qaeda and ISIS affiliates have actually increased their attacks over the last few years, specifically due to the pandemic and the limited resources that have been pushed in the region. But I want to focus on what I believe is the top national security threat going forward, and specifically affects the younger generation, and that's climate change. The rising, the effects of climate change could be, magnitudes above any security situation that we've witnessed as a human race. Specifically looking at mass migrations in the tens of millions food insecurity, instability, and what are the effects of that's going to have on our economy and on our national security, as well as just international security going forward. So that would be my number one national security priority, would be climate change and the potential side effects of that going forward.
Very interesting, Scott. Well, certainly all of you know the fact that the incoming Biden administration certainly is making climate change a priority by, in fact, appointing the former Secretary of State, John Kerry, to literally be a cabinet level official and dealing with climate change. So certainly, Scott, if that's an area that you, in certainly where you're sitting at the Department of Defense and the U.S. Army and Special Forces, that's an area you want to engage in. That's certainly one that's being very highlighted and prioritized coming forward. I want to pick up on one thing you mentioned. You mentioned Russia, because it's interesting to me in the foreign policy and national security community. Actually, Russia and China, there's still quite a discussion about it. The focus is not just only on China, but also looking at what Russia is doing with China, and then what does that mean for the United States? So I want to go to a different question that, I don't think always gets asked. And Heeu Millie, let's go to you first. And that's basically, what do you think is the most overlooked issue facing America today?
I think I'm going to continue the discussion of cyber. I know that cyber threats from state actors is pretty, it's an openly talked about issue, and it's covered in the media. But I think one issue that's overlooked is like the cyber threats from non-state actors, the cyber threats to individuals and network security, and also corporations. And I think because these are more frequent intrusions, and much difficult to not only detect, but also hold accountable. I think these cyber attacks that are perpetrated by non-state actors is an issue that American society and American people don't necessarily focus a lot of their attention on, but I believe is critical to not only national security, but also public safety and the economy and the protection of vulnerable networks in the US.
Well, you certainly have worked a great deal in this area. I'm going to open it up. Who agrees with Heeu Millie? Would that be a choice of the rest of you? Does anyone agree with that? Jump in.
Well, I think really full stop, the most overlooked issue has really been human trafficking. And that's why I'm proud at something done at DHS right now that has been, raising public awareness on the issue, is the Blue Campaign. And the Blue Campaign is a national public awareness campaign that actually earlier this week, the campaign hosted a social media campaign called #WearBlueDay to raise awareness. And people were asked to wear blue, kind of like right now, I guess, with my tie. And they're asked to submit something on social media with the hashtag. And that's to educate our friends and industry partners, law enforcement, the public, to recognize the indicators of human trafficking and how to report the possible cases. So that's one thing that I'm very excited and proud that that's been raised more, and I think it's been overlooked.
Before I go, I'll go to Scott and then Tom. But before I do, I just want to give my own view. I think both of you raise important issues. Heeu Millie, on cyber, I know that from working in private industry, actually that's something that, separate from government, industry worries about significantly. And there's the issue of preparedness for dealing with cyber attacks. And are we prepared? What are the steps? And there have been so many layers of that. Some have been very hands-on, some have not. But I know that private industry in particular fields, it is an overlooked issue. And then Max, human trafficking. When I was an Undersecretary of State, actually, I did have in my line the Office of Trafficking in Persons. And it is an issue that still needs very strong advocacy. There's a lack of knowledge about it. And there's also even the challenge of just having laws that are in place, and I'm not speaking of here only in the United States, but also abroad, because our environment and our borders are porous. Many trafficked victims get in. So thank you both for flagging those issues. Scott, let's go to you.
I'm going to take a different direction and more speak on a region that I think that the United States is not specifically focused on, where I believe we should be. And I mentioned it earlier, talking about violent extremism, and it's West Africa. West Africa is home to one of the youngest and fastest growing populations in the world. And it's also a place where we've mentioned some of our peers, our near peers, Russia and China, are also trying to grow their influence, specifically with China and the Belt and Road Initiative. And Russia has been doing increased military sales within the Sahel. I think it's a prime time for the United States to step forward and take up a greater presence in the area. We do conduct limited combat operations and counterterrorism operations, as well as foreign internal defense operations, training our partner forces in the region, as well as partnering with the French military in the region. However, I think it's just a great opportunity to engage at all levels of government, as well as across the NGO spectrum, to expand the influence of American values and have those take place of where China and Russia are trying to integrate themselves into a large growing market that will outsize the population of the United States rather quickly.
Scott, thank you for that. I had, when I was undersecretary, the privilege of going to Mali. And I think about what has happened, because you've mentioned, in terms of Western Africa, I mean, how the challenges that have been presented. It's interesting. You also mentioned an area where I think there's an opportunity for collaboration with other countries. Clearly, France has a lot of interest in Western Africa and a desire to work collaboratively with the United States in dealing with the challenges that are posed there. Tom, let's go to you and hear your view.
I think I would like to just reiterate on the public debt and deficit, just how extreme it's gotten. I think it's been overlooked by both parties. This kind of thing would lead to massive inflation, which would affect the economy all over. It could cause sort of dissent and disruption within the country. People's retirement accounts, just their savings will be diminished greatly. I think this idea of modern monetary policy, whereby it doesn't matter how much we spend, is completely wrong. And I have a feeling that a lot of politicians are starting to skew towards that. Beyond that, I'd also say divesting our industry and defense supply chain from China is a pretty big issue, not just for the United States, but also for partners like Australia, where their entire economy is sort of really based on how much China purchases from them, especially raw materials. And they're really beholden politically and economically to China, which I feel is a big issue that we need to tackle.
Tom, I didn't mention in introducing you that you also did work at OMB. So maybe that does explain a little bit of your focus on this topic. So good for you. Let me just pause for a minute and just remind our viewers, please do come in with questions. We are going to take some questions from the viewership in the last 10-15 minutes of our discussion. So do use the Q&A function, and we'll look forward to hearing from you. But now this part, what we like to do, I'd like to go to each of you individually and focus in on some of the specific areas that you personally have worked on. So let me begin with you, Scott. As I introduced you, you are in Special Forces. So a question for you is, in your view, how has technology impacted traditional warfare? And what would you like to see changed?
That's a great question, Ambassador, and one that I could probably spend days and days talking about all the differences. However, I think it's important. I'll just pick one element of it, and so there's 8 elements of combat power. I specifically want to just focus on the information and how information has changed warfare, as maybe my father's generation would see it from the World War II Korea perspective. So funny enough, last week I had a phone conversation like I do almost every other week with my grandfather, who is a Korean War veteran. He was a Marine, and he just began reading a book on Afghanistan because he was interested to try to see how our different combat experiences and how my experience in Afghanistan differed from his. And from almost a direct quote from him was, "Your war was completely different than mine." He discussed the level of responsibility of the leaders and regarding just the level of information they had to know. So my generation growing up, going to Afghanistan and fighting in the age of social media, where our adversaries have cell phones where they're able to tweet or send out posts almost immediately and spread propaganda and disinformation in real time, greatly affects the battlefield. Additionally, having leaders that are able to watch overhead from ISR platforms, the combat going on live. So even the President of the United States, as we've seen the pictures of President Obama while he was watching the Bin Laden raid happen live. So you have leaders at all levels that are able to interject themselves into the combat situation where they previously hadn't been able to do for my father and grandfather's wars. So that's, I would say, is probably the biggest difference is you have this live action, almost tweet or Facebook post, videos getting posted of things going on, and all this information to draw on for intelligence purposes. But some things I would like to see change. First off would be the acquisitions process. I would say is a little antiquated. Currently, it was developed based on, we had DARPA or other organizations that would develop these technologies that would allow the military to be the cutting edge. However, it's now turned over to multinational corporations where they're developing these AI-enabled platforms, and some of that technology might change in a matter of weeks, if not days. So in order to stay on top of things, we need to change the acquisitions process in order to keep up the pace of the changing technologies, where some of these technologies might take months or years to implement to the military as it is right now.
Thank you so much, Scott. And, also thanks for giving that kind of generational perspective. I mean, in terms of your grandfather, and then also thinking about, well, his service in the Korean War and then your service in Afghanistan, for example. I mean, that's exactly why we're also Concordia is hosting this panel today, because, it's a new time. You're a new generation, and it's important to get and understand your thinking and perspective on things. Heeu Millie, let's go to you next. Are you concerned about a war with China? We talked earlier a great deal about it being a priority. I mean, in the foreign policy community, there's a big debate now, and there's concern that there might be a war. One of my former professors, Graham Allison, wrote an article, putting this forward. So are we also witnessing maybe a Cold War? And what do you think that a containment strategy would work here?
Thank you, Ambassador Dobriansky. That is a tough question. And I think my answer would be, I am concerned about the possibility, because we've seen the competition is taking place on multiple fronts with the ongoing tech war and the trade war. And as China really continues to expand its economic, military, and technological capabilities, and to come out on top economically amid a pandemic, I think the United States and China will continue to clash over issues such as intellectual property, trade practices, economic espionage, influence operations, etc. But I do think that war is not the only option, and it's not an inevitable reality, because I think the US and China will have to find ways to coexist and perhaps even choose to cooperate in the face of transnational existential threats like climate change. And I don't think the United States and China are necessarily involved in a zero-sum game. And I'm a bit more hopeful that the new administration will seek to find areas for mutual gain and cooperation amid the ongoing competition. That being said, in terms of the strategy, if we were to be in a scenario where both actors escalate tensions, do not find areas for mutual gain and cooperation, I don't think containment is necessarily an effective strategy, because I think China has already made significant gains economically and just in terms of economic relations with the top or the major economies in the world. And I think the US attempt to isolate China has largely failed with even America's closest allies and partners in Europe and Asia. And we've seen this kind of with US pressures to encourage allies to decouple from China or to prevent the participation of Huawei in the rollout of 5G in Europe. And so I think the United States' strategy to make countries choose between their top military partner, the United States, and their top trading partner, China, will not work moving forward. But instead, kind of to end on a positive note, I guess, in order to coexist and respond to an aggressive China, I think the US can guide other countries and their allies and partners to become more resilient in the face of Chinese predatory lending, business practices, and investment. And I think this could involve information sharing with allies and partners and cooperation on setting standards for investments and cooperation on areas like cyber. And so to kind of wrap up, I think war is not the only option, and it's not inevitable, but it is certainly a possibility.
All right, well, thank you for that and some good ideas you put forward. Max, let's go to you. At the Department of Homeland Security, you're working on a wide range of very tough and key issues. And you've mentioned one of them, and that's human trafficking, which is a global crime. What do you think are the most effective strategies for going forward for combating this crime?
Well, that's a terrific question, Ambassador Dobriansky. Really, earlier this fall, the White House released the first ever comprehensive whole of government national action plan to combat human trafficking. And that had all the interagency, all the agencies. And I guess what it started out with is that saw that human traffickers continue to use force, you continue to use fraud, and they continue to use coercion against millions of victims worldwide. And they continue to target people they think are vulnerable and who maybe are emotionally vulnerable, and they face economic hardship, or they have been leaving political instability, and or they have a lack of a social safety net. So for an effective strategy, the plan was built around the three pillars laid out in the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000, which is prevention, protection, and prosecution. And we added one more layer, or a fourth pillar that was added to enhance collaboration with a multitude of stakeholders on the outside. And so that has been a very effective strategy, and that was announced earlier this fall.
Great, thank you for that. Tom, now let's go to you, our last targeted question, and then we have some questions I'm going to put forward that has come in from the viewership. Let's go to the Middle East, because you have certainly focused on the Middle East, and we've witnessed the signing of the historic Abraham Accords, and now Morocco most recently has established diplomatic relations with Israel. What's next? Can you envision diplomatic relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia? And what's next?
Thank you, Ambassador. Yeah, I think the Abraham Accords and then deals with Morocco and Sudan, it was a world-changing event that was unfortunately overshadowed by, domestic issues. I think had it happened 20 years ago, it would have been celebrated as a vital move towards peace in the Middle East. I think it's a realist recognition that Israel has a right to exist, that they'll be there permanently, that Iran is the true threat in the region, and a recognition by Arab nations that the Palestinian Authority has been overly intransigent on the peace process. They need to drop the idea that Israel doesn't have a right to exist. I think Saudi joining this agreement or any sort of agreement in the future is highly likely. I don't think they would have allowed UAE or Bahrain to sign on to an agreement unless they personally approved it, just because of how tied they are in terms of their relations. And Saudi Arabia is definitely sort of the crown jewel in getting, towards peace in this region. And I think if Iran continues to act the way they have been acting, and there's no sort of plan, there's no sort of prospect that they won't. I think that'll likely bring Saudi Arabia to the table on this sort of thing. Just depends on what Biden's sort of plan is when it comes to bringing peace about.
Okay, all right. Let me, I'm going to weave in two questions that have come in. One is that none of you have really mentioned per se multilateral institutions. And the question basically says, do they matter? So who wants to take that? That's the first one. And then the second one is the targeted one. Who wants to take it?
I'd like to take it.
Great.
I think they do matter. I just think that we need to do a better job of, electing the people to the positions in our IOs that will bolster American interests and Western interests. I think China has obviously sort of infiltrated and put their people in power. And we need to do a better job of countering that. And until then, I think, IOs, they need to have a lower position than they do now. But once we sort of bring our interests to the table, we need to elevate the organizations.
Scott, Max, Heeu Millie, do you guys agree with what Tom said? Do you want to jump in? Any of you?
Yeah, I agree with what Tom said. And I think that multilateral institutions provide important frameworks for countries to kind of have that step one to start a conversation. And I think the pandemic has also revealed kind of questions and doubts about the efficiency of multilateral institutions. But we have also seen kind of countries turning to regional organizations, close allies and partners for solutions, and that could potentially evolve into taking place at multilateral institutions or kind of incorporating or bringing those conversations to a larger platform such as multilateral institutions. And so I think that they remain important and kind of like they can provide a platform for countries to have these discussions of transnational and existential threats like climate change.
Thank you for that. And it's true, multilateral institutions certainly provide opportunities, but they also provide challenges. Let me go to a different question. And that one is targeted to you, Scott, because you raised climate change. And the question is, so how do you deal with climate change in the Arctic? Is this an issue that the Pentagon and DoD is focused on?
To be honest, I'm not an expert on climate change, and I've not even looked in too much to the Arctic. So as far as DoD initiatives in the Arctic, I'm completely ignorant on that. However, I do think it's important for the United States to take a role in climate change itself. As you mentioned, Ambassador, with the incoming Biden administration and the steps they have with the new cabinet position with Secretary Kerry. I think it's extremely important. I think the United States is in a position to re-enter the Paris Climate Accord and take a leading role in leading the climate change for the future. And I think it's an important role. I think getting the rest of the world on board is going to be more of the challenge, especially within the developing world. And then with economies like China, where they have more coal plants being currently built than the United States has in use currently in use. So those are some challenges that we're going to have to deal with the coming decades.
By the way, thanks, Scott, for taking that and thinking about, that's right, your particular assignments and posting and where you've been that hasn't been your region, but appreciate your taking that on. I think it was valued that you raised climate. So, but the connection was to the Arctic and all, I think because of the issue of the melting of the ice and the competition that's taking place up there. Let me go back to some questions that I want to ask, and I'm going to go to you, Max, first on this one. And that is, who's your political hero? Who's your inspiration?
Well, that's another great question, Ambassador Dobriansky. Well, for me at least, I really, I don't know if I said this earlier, I'm a native Texan. I think Ambassador Dobriansky, you mentioned that. I'm a big admirer of former Secretary of State, James A. Baker. And I ended up writing a thesis about him. And I guess if I could put it in a nutshell, why I really did enjoy studying his life, studying what he accomplished in public life, but also what he achieved, is he was always prepared. Or at least his creed was the 5 Ps, was prior, preparation, prevents poor performance. And really that was something nice when I arrived into government just a few months ago over the summer. And really it's a nice something to think about, at least for us that are younger and this crowd, that rather than winging it all the time, it's always a little nice that, hey, preparation's pretty cool. And but no, really, I think Ambassador Dobriansky, that Secretary Baker was a big political hero of mine.
By the way, have you had a chance to speak with him or engage him?
Thankfully, I was able to interview him, and looking forward to when I go back to Houston in a few months to go take a photo with him. And so, yeah, I'm a big admirer of his and of all of what he achieved.
All right, great. Well, outstanding. Tom, how about you? Who's your political hero inspiration?
I'd say it's pretty hard these days, but definitely Secretary Hagel. I've actually had the opportunity to meet him, and he's sort of center right, and he's definitely bridged the divide back in the Senate between parties. He actually reached out to the other party, and then even served under a Democratic administration, even though he was a Republican. And he spoke out where he thought he needed to. Definitely didn't follow the sort of party line. And what he did in his positions, his short-lived tenure in the secretary position, I felt pretty inspirational about our future in terms of bridging those divides.
Very interesting. And by the way, Scott, Secretary Hagel was one of the most outspoken senators about the issue of climate change. That's something he got very engaged on. Let's go to Heeu Millie. How about you?
I don't think I can choose a single person as my political hero or inspiration, but I have great respect and admiration for U.S. Foreign Service officers and diplomats, and kind of imagine them as a bundle as my political hero or inspiration. And I think this is because I think the United States draws its strength abroad from the connections that the diplomats make with not only governments, but also civil society, private sector actors abroad. And this is kind of why I hope to join the Foreign Service one day. So.
In fact, thank you. You took the words out of my mouth, because I realized when I introduced you, I did not mention that that's your goal and aspiration to join the Foreign Service. By the way, Heeu Millie, if you get into the Foreign Service, where would you like to be posted?
Hopefully somewhere in the Asia Pacific region.
Okay, well, good. Well, I'm confident you will excel and you'll be an outstanding Foreign Service officer. Scott, who's your political inspiration, political hero?
I feel as a Green Beret, I'm obligated to say President John F. Kennedy. And I also think it's very fitting for the forum that we have today as the second youngest person ever elected to president. But not only for that, for his leadership and for his open-mindedness and innovation. So just a quick story on how the Green Berets came to be. So President Kennedy visited Fort Bragg in 1961, where then Brigadier General Yarborough, who was the commander of the newly established Special Forces Unit, was wearing his Green Beret, an unofficial symbol of the unit at that time. And President Kennedy was so enamored and impressed by the unit that he personally authorized the use and the wear of the Green Beret. So to actually have a president authorize the use or the wear of a military award or uniform was pretty impressive. So impressive so that following his unfortunate assassination, the Kennedy family actually reached out to Special Forces Command down at Fort Bragg, and 46 Green Berets came up and were members of his honor guard during his funeral. And then every year since, Green Berets have participated in the wreath-laying ceremony at the Kennedy gravesite at Arlington National Cemetery.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that, and really have enjoyed listening to all of you articulate who you see as your political hero inspiration. We have only 4 more minutes before we have to close, and I'd like to just do a round again with each of you and pose the question that if you were invited to meet the president in the Oval Office, what would you say? So let's start with you, Tom.
So if I was invited to the West Wing, definitely there's been a lot of talk about unifying, but it needs to be backed up by actual action and not simply words. That means that people on the right and the left, they need to call out their own side when it's an issue. There's definitely fringe movements in both parties, and I haven't seen enough of our leaders calling out what they see as wrong. And unifying isn't really expecting the other side to accept every proposal or issue of the other side. It's really, I think, a recognition of what our founding principles are, and not really threatening to alter them in any significant way. But I see that as building trust between both sides if that happens, and getting our house in order.
Okay. Scott, what would you say?
So regardless of who was president, I think it's important to note that both President Trump and President Biden will be the oldest and second oldest presidents elected to the office. I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing. However, I would hope to discuss with them the importance of youth initiatives and in placing people of my generation and slightly younger into these positions of responsibility, whether that's encouraging them to run for office or placing them in positions on the National Security Council so that they can gain the experience to move up in the ranks and one day sit at those cabinet level positions. I just think it's really important for them to make that a focus of whoever's administration, of incorporating the younger generation so that we can learn, we can help and advise on some of the decisions that are going to affect us in our future, specifically, as we mentioned today, climate change and their growing debt deficit.
By the way, I had the privilege of working at the NSC starting at age 24, and I couldn't agree more with you. I think that that's so key. Good message. Heeu Millie, let's go to you, and then Max, we got 2 minutes. Heeu Millie.
I think I would tell the president to look to allies and partners for cooperation, look to foes for direction on what America's priorities and response should be in the world, but most importantly, to look inwards to unite Americans, as Tom mentioned, internally. And I think very fitting with the panel about the new generation, I think I would frankly urge the president to look upon the new generation and also incorporate young professionals into thinking about national security and look to them for input as well.
Right, great. Max, you get the last word on the panel.
Well, I'll be brief since I only have a few seconds, but I would tell him or her that, I'm from Texas, and Texas leads the nation in energy production, and the state also provides more than 1/5 of U.S. domestic produced energy. And really, the industry provides 10 million jobs in my state. And really what I'm concerned about is energy independence and increasing our gas imports and really exports. And also looking at what's going on with Nord Stream 2, which only just about last year, with U.S. opposition, Denmark gave permission for Russia to build Nord Stream 2, which would provide Russian natural gas to Germany. And how this relates to our foreign policy, we actually should be helping Europe to be less dependent on Russia and Iran for their energy needs, and it would be a significant strategic achievement for us. So that's what I would say, and it would be brief.
All right. Well, thank you. Let me say thank you to all of you on behalf of Concordia. It was a fantastic panel. You really shed light on a lot of issues. And to me, it was very refreshing because there were issues that, quite frankly, I had not personally thought of in terms of my own generation. And I think we have a lot to learn from you and to hear from you. And a suggestion that I am going to make to Concordia is that we will gather again, maybe a year from now, and see what you think then. Anyhow, this concludes the program. And just again, thanks to all of you. Just a fantastic job. Thank you.